Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the RTA's final Transportation Tuesday webinar. We'll get started in a couple minutes, just waiting for everyone to log on. And if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat in the meantime with your name and organization and pronouns, that would be great. Okay, it's 12:02. It kind of seems like we're slowing down on people entering the Zoom. So my name is Kendra Johnson. I'm on the RTA's Government Affairs team. I'm going to turn it over to Leanne Redden, our Executive Director, to kick things off.
Good. Officially afternoon, everyone. As Kendra said, I'm Leanne Redden. I'm the Executive Director. Just a very brief welcome to everybody for our fourth and final Transportation Tuesday webinar for this year. This topic is all centering around Transit's operating funding crisis, and not just how it's impacting our region, but I think it's important to learn and understand what's happening around, other major metro areas across our country in this sort of post-COVID world, where really this hybrid work situation that many of us are still experiencing and utilizing, is really impacting sort of the funding profile of transportation systems, especially with the loss of fare revenues. So I think many of you have probably heard, if you're paying attention, because you're also joining these webinars, our funding crisis, our fiscal cliff is going to be about $730 million beginning in 2026. And it's a very real challenge that we have to grapple with over the coming year or so to really ensure that we can shore up the transit system and really provide the level of service for our region that people, need and deserve. So with that, we're going to have some great panelists from around the country talk a little bit about their situations. And with that, I will turn it back to Kendra.
Thank you so much, Leanne. So again, my name is Kendra Johnson. I'm on the RTA's Government Affairs team, and I use she, her pronouns. We've got a great panel assembled today to talk about how Transit's operating funding crisis has affected a couple of our peer systems and how they were able to work with their legislatures and other stakeholders to secure sustainable funding and support transit. So before I hand it off to the panel, I will provide a few updates from the RTA side to set the stage a little bit. Next slide. I'll start by providing a snapshot of the transit system today. Ridership continues to grow post-pandemic as CTA, Metra, and PACE are providing more than 1.2 million trips per weekday and adjusting their service to new travel patterns. PACE hit a new milestone, reaching 78% of average pre-pandemic weekday service in April, and expects additional increases as service is enhanced this summer. CTA ridership is up 13% year-to-date, averaging more than 1 million rides per weekday as of last month, and also projects ridership to continue increasing with the warmer weather. And as ridership increases, crime decreases. In April, the system registered a 16% year-over-year decrease in crime. Weekend and off-peak trips have surpassed pre-pandemic numbers, and midday and off-peak trips continue to increase, including on Metra, where they have added hourly service on the BNSF weekend schedule, offering just as much service on Sundays and Saturdays for the first time ever. There are new fare passes and products to incentivize more regional mobility, like a new one-day pass that riders will be able to use across the system that will debut later this year. And we've expanded the region's reduced fare offerings with an income-based fare pilot on Metra. Our budget projects continued ridership growth throughout the year. Next slide. Though the growth in ridership is encouraging, due to the staying power of remote and hybrid work, we don't expect levels to return to pre-pandemic numbers in the near term, meaning that we're bringing in significantly less in fare revenue. So as a result of decades of underfunding and post-pandemic changes in travel behavior, the region's transit system is facing at least a $730 million operations gap starting in 2026, which represents about 20% of the annual operations budget. And we anticipate that this number will grow annually as we're already seeing inflationary pressures having a strong effect on the cost of providing service, meaning the system will likely need closer to $1.5 billion in new revenue to deliver the level and quality of service that riders expect and deserve. So historically, transit agencies have had two levers to address an operating budget deficit, which would be either raise fares or cut service. And it became clear during our strategic planning process that it's impossible for the RTA and service boards to solve the funding cliff that we're facing by raising fares and cutting service alone. Fare increases of the magnitude needed to fill the budget gap, which would nearly double what they are today, would drive down ridership and negate additional revenue brought in by higher fares, which would also render the system unaffordable for many. Through the engagement work that has continued since the plan was developed, we've heard overwhelmingly that RTA should pursue additional funding to maintain our system and see increased investment to make transit safer, more reliable, and accessible to everyone rather than cutting service. Next slide. As our panel will discuss, the Chicago region is not the only major transit system facing this problem. And in fact, many large peer systems hit their funding crisis point much sooner and have already taken action. So far, there have been varying approaches to addressing transit operations funding gaps depending on the nature of the system and some of the political realities. So New York's MTA will receive significant new revenues from an increase to an existing payroll mobility tax that, along with some other budget stabilization measures, is projected to balance their budget through 2027. The Washington, D.C. and Bay Area systems are relying on short-term state funding that will likely serve as a bridge, while new sustainable local revenues are pursued for future years. And then Pennsylvania's state budget proposes shifting an additional portion of sales taxes to transit, and that includes SEPTA. Massachusetts' latest state budget proposal dedicates a portion of funding from a new tax on individuals making over $1 million to MBTA. And both of these measures, Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, are not yet finalized, but do include recurring revenues that will have a significant impact on the magnitude of their operational deficits. One thing to notice here is that the magnitude of the gaps for our peers relative to the size of their operating budgets are very similar to RTA's. So because of our efficient spending and strong sales tax receipts, we're in a better position than some other systems with about 40% of our COVID relief dollars remaining today. So we're closely monitoring action taken elsewhere and through conversations like today's to learn from our peers and ensure that we pursue strategies that make sense for the system's long-term stability. Next slide. So in terms of a timeline, we're taking advantage of this summer and the fall 2024 veto session to continue engaging state lawmakers and ensuring they have the information they need for legislative action by the spring 2025 regular session. And this is where our legislative agenda comes in. So as you can see, the first two items on the agenda focus squarely on securing additional funding and some of the structural reforms required to make the system less reliant on rider fares. And the second two items focus on improving coordination in operations in ways that enhance the rider experience, and then leveraging the transit system to achieve state and regional climate goals. Next slide. The majority of our recent advocacy has focused on how state funding for RTA's free and reduced fare programs and ADA paratransit programs impacts funding for the system overall and the future budget deficit. So as you can see on this chart, these programs are drastically underfunded and have been for decades. State funding for ADA paratransit and the reduced fare and ride free programs represents 4% and less than 20% of the overall costs of the programs, respectively. And this means that local agencies are left to cover the bulk of the costs ourselves out of general operating revenue. And this is funding that could otherwise be used to support frequent and reliable fixed route service. So the lack of funding has trickle-down effects on service quality across the system. RTA and the service boards are rolling out innovative strategies to allow these programs and services to meet the region's mobility needs while improving their long-term sustainability. But it's their severe underfunding that presents the most immediate challenge, and we're looking to address it in continued conversations with lawmakers regarding the fiscal cliff. And we've also seen this conversation play out for peer systems in securing additional funding. Almost all of the funding packages that have passed elsewhere include new funding set-asides for ADA paratransit and different reduced fare programs, which suggests that these are high priorities for policymakers and transit advocates. RTA is advocating for the state to fully fund these critical programs, and by fully funding the mandated ADA paratransit service and free and reduced fare programs, the state would eliminate more than $325 million of the projected fiscal cliff. This action would put the system on stronger financial footing and allow the operators to begin to implement the kinds of improvements that riders really want to see. Next slide. As we approach the time where legislative action will be needed here in Illinois, you may have seen that some transit proposals have already been introduced in the General Assembly, and conversations around these and other proposals will likely continue into the fall and spring 2025 sessions. We welcome discussion to consider reforms on the system's funding and governance structures that can result in some of the positive outcomes that we'd like to see for riders, including improved reliability, coordination, accountability, and efficiency. The RTA will work with state lawmakers, advocates, and the service boards to analyze these potential changes, but it remains really critical that reforms come with the necessary funding to upgrade service and maximize transit's impact on the region's economy, climate, and access to opportunity for all residents. Next slide. So before I introduce our panel and hand it off to them for the rest of the discussion, we'll quickly go through some high-level summaries of a couple of significant legislative packages in New York and Minnesota. New York's fiscal year 2024 state budget included several new revenues for transit, some of them with new dedicated sources and others being one-time funds from general revenue. The main driver of new transit revenue is an increase in the top rate of an existing payroll tax for employers in the counties that include New York City, with payroll expenses above a certain threshold. This is expected to generate approximately $1.1 billion annually of the MTA's previously projected $2.7 billion operating gap. And several other sources, combined with efficiencies and planned fare and toll hikes, are projected to balance the operating budget, which hovers around $19 billion annually for the next 5 years. MTA had their long-awaited congestion pricing plan approved in April, but it has since been put on hold by Governor Hochul as other capital funding options are explored. The program was projected to generate significant revenues for their capital program, but since the announcement, MTA has indicated they will be forced to focus only on basic state of good repair projects. So as the program has not been officially canceled, transit advocates and some legislators continue to push the governor to reconsider her decision. Next slide. Minnesota's transportation package included new revenues for all modes on the operations side and for capital programs. Most importantly, for Metro Transit in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, a new regional sales tax will generate approximately $430 million annually, covering their operating gap and providing additional capital funding to continue expanding the system. Metro Transit's annual operating budget is over $530 million, so this new funding does make a significant difference. And another big component of the package requires the state DOT and MPOs to calculate greenhouse gas emissions in their transportation planning processes. So if a given project shifts the plan out of compliance with assigned greenhouse gas reduction target, the project can either incorporate additional mitigation measures that will lower vehicle miles traveled or offset emissions, or the plan risks being out of compliance and could lose certain funding eligibilities. Transit projects are one of the mitigation measures that projects can choose to incorporate to lower projected emissions. And these requirements were modeled after similar policies were implemented in Colorado, and you'll hear more about them during the panel. So with that, I am pleased to introduce our panel today. We can go to the next slide. First, I will introduce Chris Van Eyken, who is the Director of Research and Policy for TransitCenter. Chris's work focuses on encouraging transit agencies to adopt best practices and needed reforms. Chris has advocated for better transit as an agency staff member and as an external advocate. He has provided technical support to agencies in the US and abroad. And Miguel Moravec is a senior associate with the Rocky Mountain Institute's US program. Miguel has a master's in civil engineering and focuses on transportation infrastructure and revenue policy. Miguel has previous work experience with Nissan North America and the US EPA and has testified in state legislatures from New Mexico to Minnesota on transportation policy. I'll also note that Renee Reynolds, who is executive director of the Tri-State Transportation Campaign, was originally scheduled to participate in the panel as well, but she understandably had to bow out due to the congestion pricing announcement in New York and the impact that that has had on her schedule. So she sends her regrets, but we're looking forward to a great conversation nonetheless. And I will hand it over to Chris now to start the discussion.
Thanks, Kendra, and I enjoyed your presentation. Thanks for that. Miguel, let's just jump in. So you've had the opportunity to both follow but participate also in successful legislative efforts to increase funding for transit. Thinking about those efforts and looking back on them, can you talk about some of the factors that have been most critical to their success, and maybe talk a bit about what are some of the more compelling parts of the advocacy that were implemented there that really got things across the finish line?
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. Really excited to be on with you. And we're having this moment. We're having this moment as a country where states are realizing that they need more sustainable transportation systems, not just in the climate sense, although that's very important, but also in this fiscal sense. We need regular, sustainable funding to maintain our transportation system. So on your question of, what's been most convincing, what's been most compelling, there's a lot of reasons to make transit investments, right? I think the ones that have the broadest appeal, the one that really get decision makers and their ears to perk up, would be along the lines of, those direct household cost savings, putting numbers on that, number one. And then number two, also talking about the safety of a system that relies on transit more. So let's go to the cost savings. As many of you know, the New York Times ran a big piece this year about the average cost to own, maintain, and operate a vehicle in the US. That cost is now $12,000 a year, right? That's quite a bit, especially considering that the average American household has at least 2 cars. So we're in this moment where people want more affordable transportation choices. And it's a fact that if you happen to live within about a half mile of a transit stop, American households in that radius tend to have about 1 car less than households that are further away from transit. So right there, that's $12,000 of savings if you can downsize from 3 to 2 vehicles in your home. But even if you don't downsize, even if you just use your vehicle slightly less because your community has transportation choices, there are significant savings on the table from avoided gas, from avoided maintenance, and avoided depreciation of your asset, of your car. So those cost savings really capture decision makers' attention. We at the Rocky Mountain Institute have been able to put some numbers on how transit investments can help bring about those direct household cost savings. And speaking of those numbers, we also did that same exercise for safety. So compared to per mile, driving in a car versus a bus is 10 times more dangerous, 10 times more likely to experience a fatality. And if you're in a train, that's 17 times more dangerous being in a car as compared to a train per passenger mile. So while we were in Minnesota testifying about some of that, the transit policies that Kendra was just referencing, we brought up these numbers among many other benefits, saying, hey, Minnesotans would save something like $1,000 a year even if they kept their vehicles, but just had more transportation choices. Minnesotans would also avoid about 100 deaths per year from those car crash fatalities by just shifting to other trips. So those numbers really resonated with decision makers. And while there are many, many other benefits that we quantify, from air quality to reduce climate pollution, the story of household cost savings and improved safety really allow decision makers to go to their constituents directly and say, hey, this is how it's going to help you, with your kitchen table concerns right now. And I'll close on this thought by just sharing that at RMI, we have an interactive dashboard online called the Smarter Modes Calculator. You can go online and Google Smarter Modes, and you can actually click on your state to see what the benefits would be of reducing just about 1 in 5 car trips in your state as compared to a business as usual situation. And I have 3 slides that I'll share over the course of the hour. One of the slides sort of previews these benefits. Kendra, would there be a way to pop up slide number 3? Okay, sure.
Give me 1 second. I do not have screen sharing all of a sudden. So
I think I'm sorry. I changed the host to Miguel so that you could screen share, Miguel, but if you'd
okay.
rather stick with Kendra, we can do that.
I can do it from here. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Awesome.
Well, I'll just pop up really quick. We ran this nationally, our Smarter Modes calculator, and said, hey, if you could shift about 1 in 5 car trips, what would the benefit be? And here you can see some of the variety of outcomes. Nationally, it's about $2,000 per household per year of savings from avoided operational costs. It's quite a few crash fatalities avoided per year on average. And because I'm at the Rocky Mountain Institute, which is focused on a renewable energy system, there's considerable climate savings as well, something like 3 gigatons less climate pollution, which is the same as turning off all US climate pollution for about 6 months with current pollution numbers. It's an outstandingly large number. But yeah, with Chris, I'll turn that back over to you.
Yeah, and I really appreciate those numbers, because I think here you're making a case that's, it shows the climate benefits, it shows the public health benefits, and it shows like those pocketbook benefits that folks really show up and complain about when, if their costs are going up for their car, it's shown historically when gas prices go up, when car costs go up, transit ridership follows that. So folks are much more keen to see investment in public transit in those situations. And I think we get a lot of questions right now, I think both of us, about, more folks are working remote, more folks are locating further out of the city. How do you justify investment in public transit when, maybe folks are more reluctant to ride it? But it really makes the case for, like, there are a number of reasons why it's beneficial to both your city, to riders, and just to like the world. If we have more folks thinking about riding public transit, we're going to see fewer fatalities from road violence, and we're also just going to see tremendous benefits towards GHG reduction and VMT reduction, which are especially important in this moment as we are thinking about how to meet 2030 goals for our climate.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of positioning transit as a wise investment with current context, I think it really involves answering this big question of what our transportation system is for, right? If it's just for car owners to commute to work, that's one thing. But if it's for maximizing, for every dollar you put in, maximizing everyday mobility so that everyone can go anywhere they want to, that's a different question. If you are thinking about your economic development, right? Transit can be an answer to that. If you're thinking about your climate strategy, transit is a huge booster on meeting climate goals. So, I know it's difficult for states to go out there and be the leader, and I want to bring some case studies into this kind of concept. But, if you're making the case, hey, transit, going big on that's going to be a great investment, you can look to the case of Washington, D.C. I'm based here in D.C. RMI has an office here. And I know many of you have probably heard of Randy Clark. When he took over the WMATA system, the system faced many of the same challenges that Illinois is now facing. They had one of the biggest drops in ridership nationally, right? They had actually about the same, financial fiscal cliff ahead of them, $750 million or so. And they have to work within competing jurisdictions, Maryland, Virginia, and DC. They have to compete, among those three to coordinate their sustainable revenue. So certainly a very similar challenge, but they took that opportunity to, rather than cut service in light of the financial shortfall, they actually went all in. They bet really big on transit. And now today in 2024, WMATA in DC runs more trains than it ever has before. So Randy and the WMATA team made this big bet that if you make transit service the best option to get around, people will come. And in DC so far, they are coming back. Ridership is back to 75% of pre-pandemic levels and growing. But what's really interesting if you dive into the data is that on weekends and to certain destinations, transit ridership is actually higher than it was before the pandemic. And so it gets back to that main question that I was talking about. What is the point of the transportation system? Who are we serving? When are we serving them? And WMATA made this big bet to go beyond just commuting. And they made their service so essential that they're now in a better position to negotiate with Maryland and Virginia and DC about sustainable revenue. They've secured something like $480 million in temporary funding, and they're now convening a big board to make that more permanent. So if you build it, they will come. If you make a great, reliable transit service, the ridership comes back. And this concept of building it and having folks come is not just applicable to the riders, but also to businesses. And this is another great framing to get decision makers excited about transit investments. One fun fact from the World Economic Forum is that 22% of total US gross domestic product comes from the 1% of the nation's large metro areas that are walkable, or in other words, that are great places to put transit. Amazon famously chose New York City and Arlington, Virginia to house its Amazon headquarters 2.0. They did that over a lot of other cities, in part because these two locations had excellent walkability and transit connections. And even post-pandemic, we're seeing institutions ranging from the FBI to Marriott hotels continuing to place their headquarter buildings, their new buildings, near transit stops, because these big corporations understand that the best talent out there wants to live in convenient, walkable, transit-served communities. So, we have talked to legislators in Michigan, right, where they make automobiles, and I'm very happy and proud of that industry, as they should be. Who maybe are on board with moving folks, out of cars per se, but are really excited by the economic development opportunities of making sure their downtowns like Detroit are transit served and walkable to retain the best and brightest around the country. Those are just a few examples. There's many more. And we haven't even talked about the climate piece yet. So I'll turn it back over to you, Chris.
Yeah, that's some great context, and I really appreciate you talking through the Washington example, because Randy Clark and WMATA's approach has been interesting in that normally agencies respond to funding shortfalls by cutting back on service instead of just meeting the challenge head on and proving, we can really be strong if we have money come back to us, and doing it not just in commuting hours, but as you say, off peak and off weekends. So folks realize that it's really not just a tool for getting reward, but a life tool when you have a good transit system.
And I will just jump in. I see a couple of hand raised. We will be answering questions at the end from the audience. So if you can hold it till the end, that would be great. And we will get around to everyone. Thanks.
So Miguel, in your conversations with policy leaders and legislatures, I know you've done this in Minnesota and you're doing this now in Michigan. How do you sort of take on conversations where they're talking about, in our context, we have limited resources, we can only do so many things. How can we justify investing in public transit, which primarily serves cities, when we have so many folks in the suburbs and rural areas clamoring for transportation money? Are those hard conversations to have, or is there a balance here that we can?
First, they're really difficult to have. And there's one concept that's so important to get out of the way with decision makers up front. And it's this idea of traffic and what actually solves traffic, right? Because a lot of elected officials, government officials, they'll be on board for transit until, it's time to prioritize that budget. And then they say, oh, actually, I need to deliver traffic reducing solutions to my constituents. But the truth is, and we've known this for decades, highway expansion in particular does not really effectively alleviate congestion in the long term. It actually induces more demand, more cars to roadways. And until you address that big elephant in the room, you can't get serious about discussing doing new and exciting things in the transit space. So I have a great graphic that I guess I have the power to screen share that I think has been effective in this discussion about how do we really reduce traffic for our folks back home. And I'll pop it up. So this graphic comes from our friends at Transportation for America. We love collaborating with them. We just shared this slide with US Congress's bipartisan Future Transportation Caucus. And even though the population has only increased 30%, this is about 20 years here from Transportation for America. And even though new lane miles have exceeded the rate of population growth, so there's more new lanes than there are new people, actual time spent in traffic has exploded 144% over this 20-year time period, according to T4A research. So, when we get through to folks that, hey, new expansion projects, they're nice ribbon cuttings, but they're expensive. They're expensive to maintain, expensive to build, and those dollars are not moving your constituents any faster. Only after we dispel that myth can we start to have the conversation about, okay, what are the actual projects that help bring congestion down, and bringing destinations closer together with better land use, providing more transportation options through transit and multimodal solutions. Those are the things that are going to get your people around quicker. So, I think at the same time as we are, we have the data and are getting better about communicating that certain roadway projects are not solving traffic, there's also a grassroots swell of interest in folks like Strong Towns or Climate Town, folks who want to have more choices, want to have walkable main streets, because they say, hey, I hate sitting in traffic to drop my kids off at school. And if my government just put a protected bike lane in my home and my kids could go bike to school safely, I would love that. The freedom from traffic is a really exciting motivator. So, decision makers are starting to come around to this on both sides of the aisle. There's this grassroots interest in having more transportation choices. And when you address traffic, you have that opportunity to get serious about transit investments. The other thing, and I'll try and keep this brief here, but just as important, if not more important, is the equity component. When we go into coalitions, we hear a lot from the justice community that maybe climate change, maybe traffic, maybe that doesn't connect with people. But what does is if their home is next to, let's say, a big roadway project, they don't like the noise. They don't like the adverse air quality outcomes. They don't like the asthma that comes with that. And I have seen some decision makers and state legislatures really, really moved when you bring out those numbers saying, listen, here's the air quality fatality rate in your district. This comes from transportation, this is a significant share of where these air quality adverse outcomes are coming from. And it's while electrification is a huge part of fixing it, right? We're still going to have fossil fuel vehicles on the road for the next several decades, just because of how long folks are hanging onto the cars because they are so expensive. So pointing out that boosting transit, that having better land use will be a quicker fix to addressing some of these equity concerns also really resonates with decision makers who are plugged into their communities. So traffic, equity, those are excellent frames to go one step further and say, hey, this is why this is something we should do right now.
I appreciate that. And you hit on two things that I really wanted to talk about here is one, just the EJ case for why we need to see more transit investment and shifting away from just doing highway spending, but also just the need for more mitigation of congestion and in new and creative ways, not just building new highways. Like that T4A graphic you showed is just like so stark. It's clearly not working and we need to try other things. And this is something I know you spent a lot of time researching it, and I'd be curious to hear a little bit more detail. You hinted on it, but what are some of the policies that we can, think of as we think of mitigation strategies for congestion and for lowering our greenhouse gas emissions? What is most effective, and how can we even use those as tools for raising revenue for public transit and for bike ped and other modes?
Yeah. So in terms of what are the promising policies for actually causing this mode shift, causing this dollar shift into transportation options that we know reduce traffic. There were some attempts at this back in 2008, 2009 in the states of California and Washington. They have VMT targets on the books, but while there was progress made, it became sort of apparent that these goals were not stopping the projects that add more traffic, and basically, continued highway expansion has been offsetting the benefits of transit investments and other clean transportation investments. There was a great piece in The Guardian. I don't know if you all have seen this, but it's The Guardian Climate Time Bomb. It's from Transportation for America, talking about how the bipartisan infrastructure law, because the money was formula funding going to the states, no strings attached, and because we can look at the projects that have since been funded, and we can see how much of it was highway expansion. Unfortunately, it looks like the bipartisan infrastructure law is going to generate more climate pollution than if we had done nothing and just reauthorized previous spending. So, there's been these attempts of what we think are, maybe green or positive legislation that are not quite penciling out. And so this all comes down to you can't manage what you don't measure. And states like Colorado and Minnesota have taken significant strides forward to more seriously measure the pollution that will come from their transportation infrastructure, number one. And then number two, after they measure it, say, hey, we need to offset that pollution. We need to decrease traffic until we are meeting our climate targets. So I'm going to talk more about Minnesota and Colorado, but I want to pop up one other slide I have because, a lot of folks might say, hey, electrification is going to get us there. We don't need to think about changing the status quo that much if Teslas are going to be on the road next year. But I'll pop up one more slide. This one from our friends at the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. And this slide is showing, in U.S. cities, this is not national, but rather, U.S. urban areas, what are business as usual in red, transportation pollution is looking like. This is if you add it all up, right? This is a cumulative figure, 2050. And they show here in the purple line, if you were to aggressively electrify all vehicles between now and 2050, that pollution cumulatively comes down quite a bit, right? By something like 5 gigatons. But it does not meet the threshold needed for remaining below 1.5 degrees Celsius in line with the Paris Agreement, right? So this blue triangle is the carbon budget we have remaining for transportation. And business as usual exceeds it. EVs alone blows by it. But if you combine electrification with mode shift, by offering transportation choices through transit, through other multimodal solutions, you get pretty dang close to staying on track with the remaining carbon budget. So that's what this graphic is showing. Others have replicated these results from the IPCC to us here at RMI, saying that we are going to need both to stay on budget with our climate goals. And what's been happening is there are now many Midwestern and just other states in the U.S. that have committed to saying, hey, 2050, net
Thanks.
neutral. We're figuring out our, power sector system, right? We have electric vehicles coming, but when they do the math, they're seeing, wait, we as a state cannot meet these legally binding targets without addressing transportation choices as a complement to electrification. So, in the case of Colorado, they set their net zero goal in 2019. They realized that transportation wasn't going to get there, and in 2021 came up with this measuring and managing policy, where they actually assign transportation climate targets to their local regions, to their metropolitan planning organizations. And then they give them a menu of choices, whether it's better land use or transit investments, to hit the sub-targets. And because of everything else I discussed about induced demand and highway expansions, they've actually decided to not proceed with several highway expanding projects as a result of this policy. And that was sort of the shot heard around the world, right? In my opinion, the shot heard around the world, because these other states like California and Washington tried to make this, mode shift climate aligned policy, but it didn't stick. And now Colorado's done it. They actually are holistically measuring their transportation systems emissions, saying some projects are not going to help us get there. Let's stop those and let's shift into transit investments that will help us get there. So I've been talking for a bit, happy to dive into more on those, exact transit mitigations in Colorado. They did some really exciting stuff that we'll be seeing the fruit of soon. But Chris, I'll throw it back to you to help guardrail some of that.
Yeah, I'm a cynical New Yorker, and I've seen what happened with congestion pricing. I also look at that analysis that Corgan Salerno did for T4A, showing that IIJA, this big climate bill, is actually going to add GHG emissions to the transportation sector. And I also, look at Colorado's work, and I do still see some highway projects. And we know there have been efforts in other states that have not quite really gotten there in lowering VMT, even when they set targets. I'm curious, what that real stick is that Colorado is employing to make sure that we do see a real shift. And what is it that we can do? Like, the two of us are advocates, so we can push from the outside, but how do advocates work in conjunction with partners in government to make sure that they have the resources they need to really start shifting the way we're investing our dollars in transportation?
Yes, you brought up a great point, Chris. Colorado does have some highway expansions still on the book, and that would seem to be inconsistent with the climate goals we discussed, since any new roadway traffic is going to be polluting while we have these fossil fuel cars, for the next decade or two. So how do we make sure that this works? The answer is oversight, oversight, oversight. On this thread of measuring and managing, some metrics are better than others for measuring, right? State DOTs, they're wonderful at measuring traffic. They are new to measuring climate pollution. So, when Minnesota in 2023 replicated the Colorado policy, they did something slightly different to better address that. They had both greenhouse gas reduction targets and vehicle miles traveled reduction targets. That was a step forward from what Colorado did. And here's why. VMT, vehicle miles traveled, is probably a more reliable way to measure car dependency than tailpipe emissions. Forecasting greenhouse gas reductions, it can be really easily gamed based on your assumptions, but it's much harder to game measuring vehicle miles traveled on your roadways, because state DOTs have been doing that very reliably for the last several decades. An example of this, Paris saw a vehicle kilometers traveled a decrease of about 40% over the better part of 2 decades. They actually have more bike trips in the French capital than they do have car trips. And they were able to measure that with, we'll call it VMT, it's really BKT. They were able to measure that in VMT and say, oh yes, our transit investments, our multimodal investments, they're working, and VMT is decreasing, right? Whereas, tailpipe emissions, you have to make assumptions about how many EVs are going to be on your roadways. You have to make assumptions about the speed of traffic on your roadways. A lot of roadway expanding projects are sold as traffic reduction, but the literature has shown that traffic usually increases. So a long story short, on this oversight conversation of making sure these policies work, having the best metrics is helpful. And VMT is a very solid metric to measure car dependency and the ability for folks to have alternative options. So that was one way to help make sure these policies are leading to meaningful outcomes. The other way is also by having sticks, right? To make sure that all of the jurisdictions that are part of the transportation planning process really are giving their best effort towards planning their land use and transportation system to meet these declining pollution goals. So in Colorado, which has had more time to implement this, in Colorado, they have those sub-targets at the regional level. City of Denver, DRCOG, MPO, if you're into that wonky terminology, they have a specific target that decreases with time. And they're responsible for meeting that target. If they don't, if they submit a plan to the state transportation agency that's not compliant, they would lose funding. Part of what Kendra mentioned about how Colorado has raised revenue is that there's a special fund called the Multimodal Mitigation Fund. And those dollars will get spent for you towards projects that reduce pollution if you don't submit a plan that best leverages that money. So, this is one way to get all these competing jurisdictions to work together as a team to make sure those dollars keep flowing, and constituents keep receiving projects that bring all these benefit. So make sure the metrics are good. Make sure there's maybe some incentive for these different jurisdictions to collaborate. And those things in combination help create a really effective policy that changes the status quo and shifts dollars to transit. And I haven't mentioned, I want to make sure I say this out loud. I say this every talk I give about the Colorado policy. As a result of that policy, Colorado shifted over $1.5 billion away from several of these Denver expansion projects that would have added more pollution and traffic. And they put that into 5 bus rapid transit corridors, brand new. They stood up a whole new office to handle all this new money for BRT. And then, so about half that money went to the BRT corridors, and another 900 million went to building out biking, walking, and transit networks that already existed. So that's a lot of money, especially given the magnitude of the fiscal cliff that Illinois is seeing. That's a significant part of that, yeah, it was a really outsized impact, which is why we're now seeing so many states lining up and introducing similar policies in their legislatures, including in Illinois with the Clean and Equitable Transportation Act, which has something very similar to what Colorado and Minnesota have done.
I appreciate you bringing back like the action to reduce greenhouse gas emission comes back to this funding question that we're seeing here in Illinois. I think we know that while it's meaningful to make climate benefits, we do need to see that those decisions are impacting like the bottom line of transit agencies and ensuring that they're whole so they can continue running that reliable service that folks depend upon if they're going to get rid of their car. Here in New York, our congestion pricing plan was aimed towards our capital program, but there's no reason why it can't be an operations focused program in the future if that's needed. That's how London, their program, for instance. So as we think about reducing greenhouse gas emission and shifting funds at the state level, we should keep in mind that some of this is just a matter of dollars, and it's a matter of attention, and we can really make a difference if we're not spending so much money on highways, but moving that money towards our transit agencies and other bodies trying to reduce VMT.
Yeah, Chris, when the state of Colorado did their cost benefit analysis of this greenhouse gas policy, they state right up front, we're actually assuming a net neutral investment scenario where we don't have to raise any new revenue at all. We're just shifting it from one type of project to another, and bam, just from doing that, they were able to, they're now, on track by their own estimates, on track to meet their state's climate goals by just shifting. So that, that's really exciting. That's one avenue to do it. We've seen both of the states we discussed, Colorado and Minnesota, also pair that with new revenue to have robust and sustainable, operations funding and so on. But yeah, I know in New York, Senator Andrew Granardes also introduced a policy to try and capture some of this benefit with an explicit declining VMT goal. And we may see some more action on that next session.
All right, if you guys are wrapping up your discussion, that was really great. I think we have a few minutes to take some audience questions now, and both Chris and Miguel have other commitments at 1 o'clock, so I'm going to try to get to as many as possible that they can answer first, and then if there are RTA specific questions, we can move on to those. So the first one that I see in the chat here is, while making the case for more transit investment, was there any research that asked what percentage of the public actively want to mode shift but couldn't due to lack of transportation alternatives?
You know, in the case of Minnesota, there's an organization there called Move Minnesota that had some phenomenal polling about what constituents wanted to see in their transportation system. And that, combined with some great MnDOT polling, the Minnesota Department of Transportation, really show this case that, hey, you know, if the folks in your state were picking where to put dollars, very few of them would put it into new roadways. Most of them would put it into expanded transportation options. So being able to go in with polling both from advocates and from the state saying people want choices, not expansion, that was really powerful and very difficult for opponents of, you know, these sort of investments to get around. There was no argument back to that. The transportation exists to serve, you know, democratically the constituents of a region, and that's what folks want. That's what state agencies ought to do. So yeah, I'll find a link for the Move Minnesota polling that I thought was just great on this topic.
Yeah, I think a lot of advocacy groups have used that framing of mode choice rather than mode shift, because it, you know, gives that view of freedom. You can do what you want. And you know, I also want to just remember that there are folks that are riding now that think about shifting toward their car every day because this isn't working the way it should. So we really need to think about how we keep them on the system too, and that means increased investment, really increasing reliability on our program.
Thanks, guys. We have one person raising their hand. I want to make sure we get to them as well. Janet, you can go ahead and come off mute if you'd like. Maybe that was just left over from initially logging on. We will come back if Janet would like to ask a question. Sarah, I see your hand up as well.
Hello, everyone. There we go. Just chiming in from the city of Evanston. Thank you so much, Miguel and Chris, for facilitating and speaking. I just want to offer something. I kind of typed it up in the chat, but just I feel like because right now, you know, we're looking at a fiscal cliff, which is just actually getting back to like our basic services in all these US transit systems, which is not, you know, really a level of service by global standards of the best transit systems that we see worldwide, anywhere close to that as far as frequency, network density, anything like that. So I just want to make the offering to the broader community. I know there's like a lot of folks on this call, 110, you know, I do really believe that what is needed right now is for us in the transportation community and just our communities at large who know what they need to really put forward a bold, ambitious, visionary idea of what deep transit expansion looks like. I think that is what's going to get people on board, really talking about really having dense networks, new routes, really talking about high frequency, really talking about a transit system that is good enough that people who are currently in their cars would be very excited to take transit. And I think if we can, I think that's the direction I would like to see us really talking about, is saying, hey, we want to do an expansion, a big expansion of transit, and including potentially making it free for high school students or all low income people, like whatever that looks like, and actually really talking big about expansion and really what that's going to take, and really bringing the federal government into that and saying, hey, you guys have a big role to play in not just making, you know, capital investments, but in operating, because you got a big budget and you use it for tons of stuff. Let's get it in transit. So I just want to put that forward. I think we need to be talking about big expansion. And I do see that, even though it maybe sounds counterintuitive, I actually do see that as a really big part of the solution to getting past this fiscal cliff. Because ultimately it has to be compelling. People have to see the vision. They have to see, like, why should we be spending, $730 million in the grand scheme of things isn't that much. I think talking about actually putting billions of dollars into the system is very needed. And I just encourage all of us to be visionary and bold as we really talk about how we can move this forward together. Thank you.
Sarah, I'm so glad that you used
Yeah.
the term vision, because there's this great article that Bloomberg just ran that using AI to see what your city might look like if it was transit served and more walkable, more dense, is one of the most powerful ways to get people on board with this idea that, yes, we should make these investments. Look at what our downtown would look like with this light rail or this BRT, or maybe not this roadway here. So just wanted to 100% agree. This is the time to be bold. I know there are folks in the federal government as well, Senator Markey comes to mind, who are putting out bold policy to make a renewed federal transit investments to change some of the strings attached about how transit money is given out from the federal government. So just yes all around. This is the time to be bold. People are really waking up to this moment.
Yeah, and I would just applaud that and say a need for vision is so important. I so often talk with folks that work at their state DOT or at their MPO, and they have a long list of highway projects or like overpasses and other things that they just haven't gotten to and they still want to implement. And when it comes to conversations about shifting towards transit or bike ped, they have a much shorter list of projects. So if we can start filling those lists out and giving them more examples, we'll get more positive attention for our transportation programs.
Thank you so much. That was great discussion. We have a question here. You guys touched on a little bit of sort of the city versus suburbs dynamic, that plays out in almost every transit funding conversation. One question asked, how can suburban communities engage in the issue of the fiscal crisis and modifications or changes in transit funding?
Sure.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead, Chris,
Yeah,
you first, please. No, that's a TransitCenter question. I'll let you take that.
yeah, and I think it's key that the suburbs do continue to play a role here. We don't want to abandon them. And there are lots of hard conversations that have to be had about representation. A lot of boards that represent transit investment don't represent the city quite to the extent they should. But again, transit can also serve suburbs. We see lots of regional systems like RTA, where folks in the suburbs do have a real reason to want to engage with their transit operators and make sure that they're fully funded, because why ride into the city in a car when you can take a regional rail system or an express bus that will get you there much quicker, cheaper, and you don't have to worry about parking once you get there. So we do need to engage with suburban representatives and legislatures and ensure that they're really bought into this vision as well, because a lot of folks in the suburbs enjoy their cities and want to go in every day, and they really want to see them be healthy places. So you have to think of compelling messages for suburban voters. And I think, just the vision of not having to take your car to the city when you go to see a play or visit family or go to a restaurant is one that's really strong for a lot of folks.
Yeah, I think one thing that we've seen play out in our region has been a lot more suburb to suburb trips as well. And with an aging population in the suburbs, our paratransit programs are really crucial, and dial-a-ride, things like that. So there are definitely parts of the transit system that are really important to people in the suburbs as well as people in the city. We might have it looks like we have one more minute. So if anyone has a burning question for Chris or Miguel, now's the time. I don't see any, but that was really great, guys. Thank you so much for participating. And thank you for everyone who tuned in and asked questions and contributed to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you all for hosting us, and thank you all for listening in today.
Thank you. The session was recorded, so that'll be sent out to everyone afterwards as well and posted on YouTube.
Thank you so much, Chris, for moderating, and RTA for hosting. This was just wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.